Chris. So today, the 26th of October of 2020, speaking from the University of California, Berkeley campus in its location on occupied Ohlone land, it is an immense pleasure to introduce Dr. Christopher Teuton, Professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Washington, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. He received his BA in English at the University of Colorado Boulder, and before taking MA and PhDs in English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He co-edited Reasoning Together, a collectively authored anthology of critical articles by American Indian literary critics, which received the most influential books in Native American Indigenous Studies in the first decade of the 21st century prize, one of the longer prize titles that I've heard, from the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. Dr. Teuton published in 2008 a monograph, Deep Waters, the Textual Continuum in American Indian Literature, which was nominated as Best 2010 First Book by members of the Native American Indigenous Studies Association. He has published articles in such journals as Textual Cultures, the Canadian Journal of Native Studies, Modern Fiction Studies, and Studies in American Indian Literature, as well as in edited collections in the Oxford Handbook of Indigenous American Studies. Dr. Teuton's next book project took him along a slightly different path, becoming part of a collective process of producing part of the Native American textual canon. Returning to his ancestral home in Oklahoma, where he had previously worked with the Cherokee Nation to build a Cherokee K-12 curriculum, he joined with four renowned Cherokee storytellers and elders, Hastings Shad, Sammy Still, Sequoia Guess, and Woody Henson, becoming a member of the Turtle Island Liars Club and documenting Cherokee stories, teaching values, and lifeways. This collaboration produced a remarkable book, Cherokee Stories of the Turtle Island Liars Club, which was named as a 2013 American Book Award winner by the Before Columbus Foundation, this being one of the preeminent American literary prizes that recognizes, quote, outstanding literary achievement, unquote. I was honored to witness part of the process of writing this book up close when he and I were both resident scholars at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 2009 through 2010. Now, this book is really hard to fit into a nutshell. It contains stories, lots of them, beautifully transcribed in a way that allows their distinctive poetic features to meet the reader's eyes, and some in Cherokee syllabary, transcription, and English translation. It is also a story of relationships between these five individuals across generations, particularly with the grandparents and other relatives who taught them the stories, and with grandchildren to come, audiences, places, cultures. It is a deeply personal story for the collaborators, weaving together lives and deaths, the effects of continuing colonialism and racialized violence on geographic, linguistic, and cultural dislocation, wisdom, generosity, and a celebration of an orientation to the world that uses the power of stories to hold individualism and crass materialism up for critical inspection. But it's time for me to stop talking about Cherokee Stories of the Turtle Island Liars Club and about Dr. Teuton himself, because all of us would much rather hear him talk about the book and himself. Welcome, Chris, and how wonderful to be in conversation with you again.
Mado, Charles, Mado, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with you. It really is. And it's so delightful to see you after so many years and have us this chance to talk, because you were a big influence on this book. And that year we spent together was when this was all of it was coming together, you know, all these different stories, all these different ideas. And I was working through that whole process of how to tell the story of the Liars Club in their own words and in my words, and with the influences of so many. So it's an honor to be here with you. And I want to start off as well by acknowledging where I am. And if you look behind me, it looks like I have one of these virtual screens behind me, but actually it's real. I'm in Friday Harbor, Washington, on San Juan Island. The University of Washington has Friday Harbor Labs up here in a place called the Whiteley Center for Scholars, which I find is a really wonderful place to come. I've been on sabbatical this whole year, and this coming here to work on at Friday Harbor Labs has been wonderful because it's on an island, and in our traditions, we say that in Cherokee traditions that the world began on an island surrounded by water you couldn't drink. So in working on this next book project, it's been really nice to be in such a place. I'm in Lummi territory, Swinomish territory, Coast Salish territories, and I want to acknowledge that I'm a guest on these lands, and that my department and my own work as a researcher, scholar, and someone who works in community is dedicated to creating space for these peoples here. And it's a really honor to be here with you today. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much. And I'll tell you, the influence there was mutual, because I was working, Claudia Montini Briggs and I were working on a book of stories too. These were also about Indigenous stories, but these were stories about people facing a rabies epidemic. So really, they were different stories, different contexts, but that mutual support and challenging each other to really do justice to the stories, to the tellers, and the people they're about was just wonderful. So just great. All right. Deep Waters is a fascinating work that looks at a broad range of Native American forms of representation across the Americas, from visual arts to storytelling to literature. By exploring relations between what you call oral, graphic, and critical impulses, the book attacks old binaries between orality and literacy and challenges their simplifying and distorting effects on ways of understanding Native American creativity. It is also a consummately scholarly book. So please tell us a little bit about how and why you decided to shift to the very different sort of project that resulted in Cherokee Stories of the Turtle Island Liars Club. And were there any particular experiences, any aha moments that drew you along this path?
That's a really great question. Yes, I think it goes back to my love of stories, and my love of storytelling. I grew up in a family of storytellers, raconteurs, I grew up with my grandmother who told stories. So my love of my entrance into the whole study of English and literature was really through stories, through the love of stories and really love of community and folkloric traditions, really. And when I entered college, I'm a first generation college graduate. So I didn't really know what to expect. I went to the University of Colorado, and I followed in my brother's footsteps, who was also an English major. So I studied English. And, if I could go back and do it all over again, I would have gone into anthropology of folklore specifically, because my love of literature really is about the way it works within community. And so I dutifully continued on my path, looking for ways in which I could engage community. And that first scholarly book, that was something that came out of my dissertation. It was a work that addressed something that I saw, which was so problematic. This kind of this reified notion of what orality is. This sense that Indigenous peoples are oral peoples and have no sense of any kind of durable means of recording thought and traditions. And I just saw that as just so problematic that I had to address it. So that came out of that time period of my life. But as I was doing that work, I was also working within my own home community. I would say that the real genesis of Cherokee Stories with Turtle Island Liars Club came when I met Sequoia Guess, who was one of the storytellers, one of the Liars Club members, a real beloved friend to me, and just a beloved member of Cherokee community. And he was also a writer. So like his namesake, he's a 7th generation descendant of the original Sequoia, whose name was George Guess. He was a person of many talents. He was a storyteller, of course, but he was also a filmmaker, and he was a novelist, self-taught. So he would self-publish these Cherokee horror novels. They were genre fiction. And they were wonderful stories with mythological characters coming back into a modern context, and of community members engaging with these different creatures and energies from our Cherokee past. And they're just, they're really well loved in community. And so I interviewed him. And out of that interview, we struck up a friendship, our mutual love of stories, our love of literature, and we became really close. He passed away about a year ago in May, and it was very hard for all of us, but it was such a gift to have his friendship for so many years and really have a brother. So it was through Sequoia I got to know the Liars Club, and together we said, we should write these stories down. All of these members from the Liars Club are all people who were involved in cultural revitalization, involved in youth and elder camps. So this was part of their mission in life, was to share these stories to future generations.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. And by the way, the original Sequoia was somebody who actually developed the Cherokee syllabary.
Right. I should have mentioned that. Yes, he developed he was a metalsmith, and he developed the syllabary, and so he was a writer. So Sequoia Guest worked in that same tradition.
What a remarkable and distinguished tradition. All right. The name Turtle Island Liars Club is very intriguing, containing both the image of an island in the middle of the Oklahoma landscape and the self-appellation of liar. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we have a story about Turtle Island, about coming to Turtle Island. And that's part of the Cherokee tradition of that story about that we came, well, there's different variations of it. And that's what's kind of interesting. There's a story that says we arrived here to this place on the back of a giant turtle and departed and onto this place. But there's also the story of that North America itself is Turtle Island, that it's an island surrounded by water. And so we have that kind of, so that is a common name for this place called Earth. But in Cherokee, we call it Elohi. That's actually the name for Earth. But people will use Turtle Island as well. So it's one of those terms that has different history and orientation. There's different ways you can look at it. And it was one of those kind of fluid definitions in Cherokee community about what is Turtle Island, where does it come from? But people often talk about, this indigenous place of North America is Turtle Island, and you'll find that, of course, across different cultures as well. But liars is another interesting term, and that was it's such a key part of this book, and it was so fascinating to me because in Cherokee we don't have a word for storyteller. There's no word for storyteller specifically. The word is galgog, which means liar. And the reason for this is because in our language, Cherokee language is a very specific language. It's a polysynthetic language with prefixes and suffixes that really create these kind of, what we would think of as a verb is more of a kind of a word sentence. It contains a lot of information. But we, part of our understanding of truth has to do with whether or not someone was actually physically present to witness an event. You can only really say something truly happened if you were there and witnessed it. And so if you were not, there's a suffix that is added to a word that indicates that it's as told to knowledge. And now whether you read a history book or someone tells you a story, they'll add that in. That's added in the language. So there's always this contingent truth. Truth is contingent upon your own personal verification of it. And the result of that is that any of these stories that take place long ago where no one was there to witness it, by very definition, they are as told to knowledge. And with that acknowledgement, there comes a point where, well, how are you supposed to acknowledge whether this is true or not? Well, that's up to you. That's up to each of us to make that determination. As my elder Hastings Shade would often say, his elders would tell him, why would I lie to you? I'm not going to be around forever. Why would I tell you an untruth like this just to deliberately deceive you? I'm telling you what was told to me. And so it creates this chain of trust through the ages back into the past, hearing these traditional stories and stories of mythic time. And there's an element of faith and trust and belief that goes along with those, whether or not one wants to consider them truth. But in the end, they're all these stories that considered that are of the ancient past could be lies. And so in a playful way, liars are people who tell these stories of the ancient time, of myth, of legend, of things that cannot be verified because no one was there to see it, who's still alive. And yet these are, at the same time, the very source of Cherokee knowledge, Cherokee epistemology. So there is that slipperiness, that slippage between truth and fiction, truth and lie. And it is between the storyteller and the listener that the meaning of those stories kind of take shape. And so I had a lot of fun talking with them about, what's truth and lies, what and how to, and what is the role of the storyteller and the listener with regard to them both.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, one thing that's amazing about languages that have what linguists call evidentials is the way in which, you can slip in this little bitty tiny bit of sound, which all of a sudden positions the knowledge-making process
Right.
alongside, attached to whatever you're talking about. I saw this. This could be, or I heard this. So that's a wonderful point. I also think now, for me, the term liar has had this sort of Walter Benjaminian shift where he says translation means you always want to be able to transform the language into which you're translating. So for now, for me, the word liar will always have a new and wonderful resonance as a result of having read your beautiful book. For this reader, one of the most interesting aspects of the book is that you present your collaborators' own biographical sketches and the process of obtaining them. For example, you ask Woody Hansen, do you want to give me a little bit of bio that I can put down for the book? So could you tell us why you took this approach to introducing them and how it shaped the project?
Yeah, that's really interesting. As you can tell from my bio, I am not a trained ethnographer, right? This is not something that I was trained as a literary scholar. And so part of I think it was kind of fortuitous in some of the ways in which that lack of training became apparent in this book. But I think, that's a kind of question I think you likely wouldn't happen if someone was trained in doing kind of really kind of field work, ethnographic work, to ask a question, to ask one of the people you're working with, who are you? It could have happened, I mean, sure. But for me, I really liked the way in which they responded. I took that approach because I wanted to hear it in their own words. And I wasn't quite surprised in the way they responded, in that they couldn't really tell me who they were. They had to ask others who they are. But even in disclaiming that they're not going to tell who they are, they did share a lot of who they are. And I thought, and I really liked that in the end. But I think, part of my, one of the ways in which I wrote this book is I wanted to come at it as a person who I am within the context of that community. I'm a young Cherokee person at the time, younger Cherokee person, someone who's looking to learn from his elders. And I kind of resisted the polish of that training. I could have sought it out for myself at the time, but I wanted to do it within a kind of a more organic context, I guess I could call it. I'm interested in what you find fascinating about that approach, the ways I asked about the bio.
Well, I won't disagree with you, but I do have a different interpretation of
Sure.
that, which is that rather than a sign of a lack of professional training as an ethnographer, I saw this first of all as a denial of ethnographic authority.
Yeah.
You, as the writer, you're the scholar. You can tell the reader who these people are.
Yeah.
And you disclaimed that power, right?
Yeah.
And you negotiated with them. So, in some sense, putting them as individuals on the line. So tell me who you are. And of course, what did they do? They immediately, turned that over and said, well, I don't know what to say. And then another one of their friends said, well, I'll give you a bio. And they said, no, wait a minute. And then what almost always came out was a story.
Right.
So frankly, I read that more as experimental ethnographic writing.
Well, I'm glad you do. I mean, and it was a part of the humility I felt amongst these people that I just really, I didn't feel in a position to actually describe who they are. You know, I wanted to get their response, knowing probably full well that they would demur in some way.
Well, I would say that you, given the humility of the other members of the club, I think you fit very well in having
Thanks.
known you over these. So you write that, and I'll quote you. Nothing worse than being quoted with your own words, but here you go. Some stories are presented using an oral poetic method of transcription developed by Dennis Tedlock and Del Himes, end quote, referring to the leading and often dueling originators of ethnopoetics, approaches to finding and making visible and audible the poetic organization of Native American narratives. Both are now deceased, and they stood in a long line of white anthropologists and folklorists that included Franz Boas, Gladys Reichard, Edward Sapir, Melville Jacobs, and many more, who collected, often with the help of Native American assistants, problematic term, stories that they recorded by dictation and then later on tape, transcribed and translated. What do you see as the similarities between their work and your Liars Club collaboration? And particularly, what do you see as the differences?
Hmm.
What aspects of their work did you see as potentially problematic? And how did you decide to do things differently?
Hmm. That's a big question. Um,
Sorry.
no, I like it, but it's something we could talk a long time about. I think when I looked for models for what I wanted to accomplish with the Liars Club, I couldn't find really anything that struck me. I wanted to write with them a book about Cherokee storytelling from within a Cherokee perspective. It's Cherokee methodology, um, um, a Cherokee kind of sense of ontology, a Cherokee sense of just appropriateness, and most importantly, a book for Cherokee community. This was not a scholarly book, and that it is informed by scholarship, certainly, and I wanted it to be informed by it, you know. And I dutifully looked for other models and things to consider incorporating as I conceived and wrote the book. But I had to. What was in the forefront of my mind was to try to honestly portray the way the Liars Club saw themselves and the way in which they saw their relation to community, and to give back to the community the stories that they knew so well from listening to the Liars Club over the years, and to pass this on to future generations. So when I think about that, so, you know, when you look at Del Himes' work, for example, and the readings for today for your class, the study of performance informed my work. Now I took an ethnopoetic approach to the transcription of story when it came to people like Sequoia Guess, who are more attuned to the dynamics of traditional performance. So Sequoia was a consummate performer. He was very adept at it, and he had a certain style that he learned from his grandmother. And you know, there are so many different styles of Cherokee storytelling, and you can see them demonstrated in the book. I mean, Sequoia was formalistic. I mean, he had a certain way to start stories. I have heard him tell these stories numerous times, and they would change at times according to context, but slightly. You know, the basic structure of the story was there all the time. Hastings Shade, who was the senior elder of the group, he was a storyteller, of course, but his stories were short and to the point. He was more interested in the message, the meaning of the story, the ideas that it was passing along, and so he didn't have that same kind of complicated performative kind of style, you know. And they were fully recognized this as well, that they had different styles. Woody had a different style. Sammy had a different style. Woody's was more confessional. His storytelling came out of his personal experience. Hastings was much more involved with passing on traditions that his elders had shared with him. So he was very much about that. And Sequoia was more about um, um, entertaining and engaging the audience, I think, and among other things. But they had different styles. So that is what I felt looking at the tradition of work with native storytelling traditions. People like Himes or Tedlock or other folks like Zora Neale Hurston and Mules and Men was an influence on this book as well. I've tried to grab from some of these different works a sense of engaging with community in the way I wanted to do it, but I didn't want to distance the works from the readers and the reader's experience of it. So when I translated Sequoia's stories in that ethnopoetic style, it was to give a sense of the pauses, of the cadence of his telling, of the pacing of his telling. Those kind of things I thought worked well. But you notice I didn't do the comparative work and that kind of philological work that Himes or others do. I kept that out. So I tried to draw what I could, and then and then and that's the thing, looking at Himes's piece for today for your course. I mean, I have done some behind the scenes kind of work like that on Cherokee language, but I wouldn't put it in a book like this. It would be for scholarship, and it's more the kind of work I do working with graduate students as they kind of create their own texts. So I guess it's with that centering community. And I think part of this, and we can get to this discussion too, but it's especially in the past 10, 15 years, there's been such a focus on decolonial research methodologies within Indigenous studies, and that's really informed my work. And this book was, when it published in 2012, was on the early edges of that. It was occurring, and it was something that was in my mind, but it's even more pronounced. We can see that in some of the other readings for today too.
That's a wonderful answer. I mean, there's a very good critique, really, of both Himes and Tedlock in your answer, in that, Tedlock said it's all about the sound, and you have to be able to transcribe the phonological dimensions of it. That's the sound of the story is where it is. Himes said, no, it's an underlying structure. And they wanted to universalize this. So you had people all over the world who tried to, use one method or the other, or some of us who tried to combine them in odd ways. And your critique says that, each one of these storytellers required, right, a different mode of transcription, a different mode of analysis, that one size fits all, one sort of universalistic framework, which of course then you can brand and really export to other authors, would probably really not do justice to the storytellers or really to the analytics that they demand. I also, in terms of thinking about this, I think back to the work of Franz Boas, who worked so extensively with George Hunt as his collaborator. To his credit, he often put Hunt on the cover of books, which were transcriptions of narratives. But on the other hand, he, in his own words, cleaned the stories.
Mm-hmm.
So, I went to the American Philosophical Society papers back in Philadelphia, and there would be notes from Hunt that would say, "This thing that I have made for you," all of these ways that the stories were woven together with their relationship that somehow just got edited out of all those collections, and that certainly is something that you did not do.
Mm-hmm.
With this book, but actually focused on that process the whole time. But, I must admit, I do feel a sense of jealousy reading the book. I just wish that I was able to meet those four individuals and to be able to hear them tell those stories, because you portray them as such rich thinkers, tellers, sources of wisdom, that they really come through as people you'd really want to get to know in the book.
Thank you. Yeah, they are like that, and they're just as. I mean, I don't know if I can portray them with justice, but they are like that. And I think that was one of the challenges, just the humor that they have together, the kind of gentleness they have with each other, and their mutual respect. That's always something that I hope comes out in the book. But they often would say that the stories are for community. The stories are about creating community. They're not an end in themselves. They are of community. And So they tell them to, and even to this day, we have Cherokee storytellings that take place quite often. And a wonderful tradition has emerged where in the fall, we now have a Sequoia Guess memorial storytelling. And in the spring, we have a Hastings Shade memorial storytelling. And it brings out people, from all around Cherokee community in northeastern Oklahoma. And you'll see people with different styles, different ways of telling. And it's it builds community once again. You see people coming out, sharing, learning from one another, celebrating each other. And that's part of the Liars Club. I think that's one of the things that they're most proud of is, in their work together, was that it shared a little bit of that with people. And that's the source of what they're trying to, of what it means to be Cherokee, really, in their terms.
It's wonderful. Well, I like the note that you centered of thinking about this as part of a larger decolonial movement within Native American studies, American Indian studies, and studies more broadly. I love the way that you connected to Hurston's work. We actually had a rich discussion about Hurston and her work with LaShawn Daly, herself a storyteller who is working in performance studies now and thinking about the influence of Hurston on herself and her work. But I think there's a tremendous role now for, to use your notion of the impulse, of a loud and clear decolonial impulse that decries the effects of white supremacy and various forms of racism, and how it is that Native American narratives and narrators and communities have been portrayed. But your impulse here seems to be a sort of quiet decolonial impulse of being able to really critique some of that work, right? But precisely not in a way which is like talking to other scholars, but placing that within the perspectives, the critical perspectives of those four individuals. I think that's really a great contribution. Now, I was going to ask you about what you wanted to do with the book, but you've answered that so beautifully. So I'll just go right on to the second part of my question, which is, did it work? Do you think that this really accomplished what you and the other four members of the club who are authors of the book were trying to do for the Cherokee Nation and others through this project?
Well, I've been just really gratified that so many people have found it valuable and have embraced it. So it's hard. I'm sure there's naysayers out there who didn't like it, but I think one of the things that we tried to do and talk about this, and this was honestly how they all felt, is that we never wanted to portray anyone as being the keepers of Cherokee tradition. I mean, one of the things we wanted to talk about in the book is how Cherokee tradition is diffuse, how people in different communities, small towns all across Cherokee Nation, it's kind of modeled on the way we were always as a people when we had small villages. We're people who are united by as part of a nation and part of a culture, but there's quite a lot of differences. If you're up in Grove, Oklahoma versus Vian, Oklahoma, there's different families that have settled in those areas and been there forever. There's different storytelling traditions, different ways of speaking the language. So Cherokee community is really complicated and rich. And so these folks, the Liars Club members, they were always quick to say, this isn't the final word on our tradition. This is just what we've heard, what we want to share. And so I think that recognition diffused potential, backlash, right? And we were also very careful about what we included and what we didn't include. There were things that popped up regarding medicine, traditional medicine, or regarding the spirit world that we were careful not to include. And and sometimes they'd catch it, and sometimes I'd catch it. There were things in there that I thought, you sure we should have this in here? This is probably not, if it got in the wrong hands, it might not be good. And so we took those things out. So I think I think what people really valued was seeing people they know and community as they know it celebrated, those relationships. The stories, of course, but this is one of those things I push back on, and thinking about the structure of this work and the kind of book I wanted to create with them, is we didn't want this to be just a bunch of decontextualized stories out of the Native American, quote unquote tradition, which I find so problematic. This is stories told in context. Often these stories were told for me because I was there, or they were told for other people, or told for each other. And so it's kind of a long answer, but I think it did accomplish what we hoped it to accomplish. I know that I've heard firsthand from everyone that they're proud of it, that they share it with everyone, with their families are proud of the way they're represented in the book. They're proud of what the book has accomplished. And so that was, that's all I could ever ask for, and we did it together. So that's one of those things, is that when you work in a decolonial context where you center community and center, the goals of the work of research and scholarship, comes from the community itself, then my experience has been that you can find that balance, hopefully, that allows the book to become, or the work to become, what it should become to the community. So yeah, it's been really gratifying. It's been wonderful to see people celebrate it and tell stories from it. I've seen stories that were told in the book now being told in public in ways that, beyond the Liars Club. So you can see it has a life in of itself. And it sells quite well in our nation. And it's been taught in classes and things like that. So yeah, we're proud of it. And I think that's the thing, is I think all of us are proud of it. And, we're all represented in it, all the Liars Club. So it's been exciting in that regard.
Oh, that's a wonderful answer. I'm sure that will also be inspirational for a lot of graduate students, scholars who themselves now are so focused on really doing projects that are not exploitative, but are community-based and collaborative. One of the moment I think I treasure the most, I'd worked in a primarily Spanish-speaking community in northern New Mexico for a long time. And most then community-based projects on visual arts as well as on narrative and history, and had published a bunch of stuff. And I tried to always put whatever the analysis was there, I tried to make sure that the story was there in Spanish and English. And I was up, working with the elders, and there was one, and an elder said to me, I have a story for you. And he told me a story which was almost verbatim taken from one of the texts that I had published. And I thought, this is just wonderful, right? Here is this exchange of knowledge, which actually becomes generative in both directions. So those are wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah. And that's back to that, my first scholarly book, Deep Waters, it was an exercise for myself, and I think an intervention. I'm happy I did it. But just seeing that oral and graphic impulse, what I call that, that's the same thing. Seeing that knowledge go back and forth, seeing a written text come back into orality, it's exciting to see.
Well, white supremacy sometimes lies in the infrastructures, including the scholarly ones, the apparatuses, right? Which divide up the world in particular ways. Which basically, one of the big ones is that white supremacy is about literacy, right?
Right.
Whereas there are oral cultures, which some of these stereotypes that get reproducing. So attacking those infrastructures, I think, is an important part of the project as well.
Yeah.
Now, I could be accused of stating the obvious by saying that Native Americans are vastly, vastly underrepresented in U.S. higher education. Obstacles still appear throughout educational systems, from kindergarten to graduate school, to the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, forms of racism that Native American faculty members experience on a day-to-day basis. The devastating toll of COVID-19 on Diné and other Native American nations provided evidence even to white audiences of the mainstream media for the tip of the iceberg of multiple forms of violence that Native Americans experience daily. Unfortunately, this particular iceberg does not seem to be melting. You are an award-winning author who taught at the University of Denver, the University of Victoria, the University of North Carolina, and elsewhere before coming to chair Native American Indian Studies at the University of Washington for 5 years. What sorts of difficulties did you face along the way, and do you continue to face? How have you confronted them? So in other words, I wonder if you have any words of wisdom that you could pass along both to Native American students as well as to those of us who need to continue learning about the continuing force of white supremacy in the spaces in which we live and work.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, it's creating space for Indigenous peoples within higher education is just, it's been a lifelong process for me. Finding that space, finding a space to try to thrive, pushing back on institutional racism, and it runs the gamut through the structures of academia, through the privileging of certain discourses, through the lack of recognition of our commitments to community, to family, to things that matter to us as peoples, as full-fledged peoples, not just scholars trying to just get an education and get a tenure-track job, but people who have commitments. And I've been fortunate to have mentors. I think we have elders in community and mentors and elders in academia as well. And I've been fortunate to find those. When I was at University of Wisconsin, I arrived, and like a lot of Native scholars will find within their own departments, when I arrived, the one person who was involved in Native literature, she was gone for the year on a fellowship. There was one person. She happened to be gone that year, So, I'm a newly arrived grad student. Who do I have, who will mentor me or work with me? And, they were just inept. I mean, they just didn't really have any kind of clue. I was an anomalous thing. First of all, I'm a Cherokee person who doesn't look phenotypically, as one might expect a Native person look like, in a kind of a stereotypical, assumptive way, white passing person. And yet, so there were a lot of assumptions made about me. But I grew up in a family, with a single mother below the poverty line, a first generation college student. So this was all new to me. And I was, had to really, swim on my own and try to make it. And there were a lot of times I thought about quitting. But I found mentors in African American studies at Wisconsin. One of my mentors, Craig Warner, was in that department. And I found inspiration in working with scholars like Nellie McKay, who was really, a really important scholar of African American literature, who recognized what I was trying to do with literature, with Native literature, that I was looking for ways to theorize Native literature with the terms and concepts and ideas that come out of Native community, and not do work that basically applies Western theory to Native texts. And it got bad. I had my first dissertation prospectus conversation. My dissertation was not approved, my prospectus, because I took this approach. My advisor at the time, I was probably not one of his priorities, but I didn't find out until the actual meeting that he really disagreed with my approach and said it was kind of solipsistic, and that why didn't I just do a Foucaultian reading of Native texts? So that response was not atypical at the time from people, and it was through the mentors at Wisconsin, who, like Craig Warner, who said, that you don't want to be working with people like this. Let's find you another advisor who can help. And so I've kind of made my way that way. I just kind of didn't quit. I kind of think that I was probably so ignorant of the context at the time and how I was being treated in some ways that I didn't know how badly I was. Only in retrospect I realized how badly it went in my graduate studies like that. But what came across was the love of the literature and the love of what so many of these writers like Momaday and Silko and Visner were really trying to do. I learned from them. I saw them struggling. Their characters and the stories they told about were struggling with the same things I was struggling with. And they still have resonance for me today. So I think that's what led me along, was the love of story. And for me, my move to different institutions, to doing work, I felt fortunate because I've been able to seed in a kind of way positions in literature, literary studies. Wherever university I've been to, they've subsequently, when I've left, they subsequently hired another scholar of native literature. So, which is, you know, no small account when we think about institutional change. But I've always been looking for native community. I started in English, but I wanted to get it to American Indian Studies. That was always my kind of goal. And I found that coming here to UW. And, you know, like so many places, you know, University of Washington, Department of American Indian Studies, we're celebrating our 50th year anniversary. But we only became a department in 2009. So, and that's pretty typical. There are so many programs of American Indian Studies across the country, but so few departments. And it speaks to the way in which we're received and respected as a discipline, you know, in the work we do, you know. And we face challenges still. I mean, as Indigenous Studies has grown at Washington and hires have happened throughout the university, our departments remain small. So it's you know, to carve out a space for Indigenous knowledges to thrive at the university is an ongoing process. And I've experienced it as a student, as a faculty member, and as an administrator now. And the one thing that I feel like is you really get the most traction on making change is getting community involved. You know, community, not just at the university, but outside community. We're fortunate in Washington, there are 29 federally recognized tribes. We have the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians organization, political organization. There are ways in which we can galvanize community to support what we do. And I've heard administrators, deans call it the nuclear option. But when things have happened, for example, when a hire has suddenly disappeared, you know, potential hire that we had, the discussion about, well, I'm going to take this to the local AT&I chapter and see what they say. I've suddenly seen things turn around. So the power of community is there, and the power of working with community and being in conversation with community. I think the more and more as students or faculty or administrators, if we get separated from community, we lose our potential influence, we lose our bearings, and we have to kind of keep those ties strong. And I think that's one of the big lessons I've learned. It's a challenge because we're pulled so many different ways. Working with students, trying to get tenure, trying to make institutional change, and you know, and it's hard too because communities, you know, have their own priorities, which sometimes don't necessarily align with what our institutional priorities are within our own academic units. So there has to be autonomy, but there has to be those relations. That's what I feel.
That's a wonderful, remarkable statement. I mean, one thing that is coming from so many different communities out of the current visibility of long-standing anti-racist movements is mentorship,
Right.
both a lack of mentorship or, in the case that you recounted, destructive mentorship,
Yeah.
right? And now it's really the case that the mentors, people who are in that role, need to be taught, sometimes more than their mentee, what mentorship really means.
Yes.
And community. Well, I'll tell you, we're at the University of California, Berkeley, in a state with very powerful Native American communities that have faced the destructive effects of white supremacy, you know, at genocidal levels.
Yes.
You know, right up through the effects in the present. You know, we have a long way to go to be able to learn more about being a part of community. And I think that was a really amazing statement. All I can say is I'm really glad that other students who are coming up now precisely at the University of Washington Department of American Indian Studies, I'm sure that the mentorship they're getting is really different. And they're very, very lucky to have you, as well as I'm sure the sort of community that you've built in your years as chair and your years teaching there within your department and university. So you know, one person can make a difference, and you certainly have, both in your scholarship, but within being able to push those sorts of issues, you know, also with the power of, you know, 4 really good storytellers and the other good storytellers like your grandmother and others behind you. Thank you so much. What an honor and a treat to be able to spend a little bit of time with you. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. very much.
So let me ask you one final question here. This wonderful book was published in 2012. Where has your collaboration with the Liars Club and with other members of the Cherokee Nation gone since that date?
Well, the current project I'm working on, just actually completed, was something that was brought to me really from Loretta Shade, who is a Cherokee Nation national treasure for her decades of work in language revitalization. And she's the widow of Hastings Shade, who was our kind of senior elder as part of the Liars Club book. One afternoon a few years ago, I met Loretta and her son, Larry Shade, for lunch in Tahlequah at the Branch restaurant there near the town Branch Creek. And Loretta came with holding these two grocery bags, plastic grocery bags filled with these documents. And she set them on the table, and I asked her what these were. And she said these were words that Hastings had collected for decades. Names of animals, names of insects, names of birds, names of trees, plants, edible plants, amphibians, fish. Essentially, a collection of names for the Cherokee world that he had collected. He used to carry a little pocket notebook that he kept in his shirt pocket. And when he would meet with other elders, he'd say something like, I'm going to go meet with so-and-so. They got something to share with me, about, something. We're going to compare our notes of what our grandmas or grandpas knew. And he'd write down these names. And together, there's over 600 different names for the Cherokee natural world in these collections. And he had compiled them into these booklets. And Loretta and Larry wanted to publish these. And so we had discussions about what they could be. And I took, I left Tahlequah, went back to Seattle, and I carried these books on my lap on the airplane because these were the only copies. And this was like a huge chunk of the Cherokee lexicon. Together, there's over 600 names for the natural world, Cherokee natural world, the largest collection of Cherokee names for the natural world in existence. There's 144 bird names, for example, so many, and then a lot of these plants as well, just amazing, amazing things that are in there. And not only that, but there's anecdotes and stories that Hastings included having to do with these different creatures. So in looking over the work, I started to realize that we didn't have a dictionary in our hands here. This is an enstoried Cherokee world, a view of the natural world and the Cherokee cosmos, really, through the creatures and their names and their relations and all these things that emerge, the value systems that you see and the ways then they interact. It's just this rich cosmology. And so we began to work on it. So Loretta and I have been working on this for years, and I'm happy to say that the book is now complete. And in some ways, it's similar to the Liars Club. It's a bit of my book, it's a bit of hers, it's a bit of Hastings, and it's a bit of all these different storytellers that also were involved in it. It quickly became apparent when we started to work on it that we needed to get the insight of other elders about these creatures in the Cherokee cosmos. And so we recorded conversations and interviews with other elders, and other storytellers contributed stories as well. So it's a whole community effort, and it's called Cherokee Earth Dwellers. And so we're really excited about it. It's brought up so many different questions we could talk about. I mean, in terms of classifying things, I mean, I had to deal with, these deep questions about how the natural world is understood. Things taken for granted by Cherokee traditionalists that have never really been explained in our kind of in any kind of research or scholarship about Cherokee people, at least into the depth that Hastings was getting, and Loretta was getting as we discussed these things. So issues of classification is fascinating. I mean, issues of, and then of course how to portray the interactions, the different characteristics of the Cherokee cosmos, this three-tiered world that the Cherokee traditional Cherokee belief system is holds on to, this idea of the sky world, the middle world, and the underworld, and the different creatures and energies that infuse these different spaces. So, and then of course, the whole point of it all, which is what Hastings would call to stand in the middle. Aye clean he do gestin, which means like you will stand in the middle. And it's this idea of centeredness, of health, of wellness in body, mind, and spirit that one may attain through one's relations to these different spaces and creatures, which is the whole point of what it's all about. So it's really exciting to try to help Loretta and work posthumously with Hastings to articulate this this view of the natural world.
That's great. You know, clearly we could go on a long time. This leads me to an apology to you, and to the listeners and to the natural world, because there was a humanistic assumption in my suggestion that you collaborated with 4 Cherokee elders, because the Liars Club, and particularly now this project, also is a collaboration with stars and landscapes and animals and a much larger cast of people who are also producing knowledge collectively. This sounds really exciting. And I think it's wonderful to now conclude on a moment as you look into the future. Because I think when things are so difficult, both with COVID-19, with the way in which devastatingly unequal the fatal effects of health disparities and racialized violence are so evident, the ways in which we still confront problems. Racism still is rampant within educational and other institutions. It's really nice to be able to see somebody who is in the midst of all that carving out futures. So thank you so much for your inspiration, your wisdom, and for your friendship, Chris.
Thank you, Charles. What a